Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well as we continue to almost wrap up May of 2024. Unbelievable. We're almost done with 5 months of the year, and hope everybody here in the States is enjoying a long Memorial Day weekend. For the rest of the country, the rest of the world, hope you all are enjoying a good weekend. Hopefully you're doing well. On today's Weekend Perspective, I want to dive into a couple of things. It's something that I saw this week. Was an article that was floating around, and the source of the article and the specific article don't really matter. But the headline of the article was basically, ex-employee of a big high-tech company claims that high-tech company is in chaos with regard to their AI strategy. And, this article could be written about Meta or Microsoft or OpenAI or Google or any sort of, large company. Somebody, got a hold of one of the reporters and said, hey, I was there. I was sort of in the middle of things. How much they were in the middle, it doesn't really matter. But we're going to see a lot of articles like this written over the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever, about, either a company who should be in a leadership position in AI, a company who is a highly funded startup that didn't necessarily pan out in AI, a company that is going through some sort of change in terms of leadership or whatever it might be. But I think the biggest thing to remember here is, and I think we got a little bit comfortable with this, is we are in the very, very earliest stages of sort of the AI era. And I'll clarify that by saying, for those who have been around AI for a long time, obviously it's technology, variations of the technology that have been around for decades now, right? People talk about doing AI way back in the 1960s and the AI winter in the 80s and 90s and all sorts of things like that. But, the thing that a lot of people are going to talk about with the AI era is going to really be sort of, ground zero, day zero is going to be, tied around ChatGPT and the generative AI technologies. And again, putting that into context, and we've talked about this a little bit, a lot of these things go back to a paper that was written by Google in 2017, which we'll put a link in the show notes, called the Transformer paper, which kind of became the catalyst for what became a lot of the generative AI technologies that we're now seeing every day. So again, the reason I highlight this is, and what I want to do here in the sort of the second half of the show is dig in a little bit and look at how early we are in this. And the idea that some companies' strategy is in chaos is kind of a misnomer, because in reality, the difference between chaos and sort of normative forming kind of where they are in terms of trying to figure things out. Sometimes if you squint just a little bit, the difference between those two things is not that different. And so I think we've been in a stage for more than a decade here, if you followed the show, where cloud computing had sort of normalized itself. It sort of rationalized itself out to, hey, there's 3 or 4 big cloud providers. We sort of know who's first, second, and third. We sort of know the companies that are still doing private cloud and so forth. But even that, if you go back, 10 years or so, those things weren't terribly well defined. There weren't winners well defined. You could have looked at any of the situations going on and been like, that company is in chaos, that company doesn't have a strategy. And so I thought what I would do in the second half of the show or after the break is really kind of dive into where the leading companies are right now and kind of map out that, in reality, in any given week, they may look like they are winning, they look like they're doing well. And in any given week, there is a gigantic strategic decision that they have to make that may put themselves into that article with the headline that says, so-and-so ex-employee of so-and-so company says that they're in chaos. So we're going to dive into that after the break. And we're back. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And for those of you that have started watching the show on YouTube in video format, I apologize this week. We're not doing it this week for the simple reason that, as this is a long holiday weekend in the United States, I spent some time, quite a bit of time outside yesterday, and something got to me, some sort of pollen in the air or some sort of something got to me, got up in my eyes, and my eyes are almost basically kind of puffy and closed up. So you don't want to see you don't want to see us face to face on live camera this week. So we're going to do this one just as audio. We'll get back to doing the video show next week and then going forward. But every once in a while, we as we like to say, we have a face for radio, we have a face for podcasts. We definitely do not have a face for video this week, and that is to the best of all of you. You do not want to see that this week. So, anyways, but as we talked about at the top of the show, people are always trying to handicap, to put a scoreboard on the tech industry at any given time, in any given week, after any given keynote, after every given acquisition or major event or announcement, whatever it might be. And I think what we kind of forget, and we have a tendency in our industry to be very, have a ton of recency bias, right? What did we last see is the most important thing, but then we always, even when something brand new comes out, the next question that comes out as well, that's interesting, but what's next? And I think we are definitely in a stage in this AI era, at least the AI era that will be dominated by generative AI, of, who's winning, who's losing, who's in chaos, who is going to make the next big move? What's the next big thing? What should I study? All those kind of questions are floating around all the time. And so what I did is I just made a list of, a dozen or so companies, the ones that we talk about all the time. And I want to kind of dig into, are they winning? Are they in chaos? Are they losing? And those are all terrible terms, terrible qualifiers for where they are. But just kind of want to sort of highlight where they are and try and put into some context that, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we got very comfortable with where cloud was because it was like, well, Amazon is winning and AWS is winning and Microsoft is more or less second, although we're not exactly sure how far behind in second they are. And third place is some sort of, combination of maybe it's Google, maybe it's Oracle, maybe it's Alibaba Cloud, whatever it was. But it was sort of, the world sort of rationalized itself out that way. But, again, the thing I would hearken back to is like, if we go back to, go back to 2011, go back a decade or so, go back to 2013, if you looked at the thing that was called the Cloud Magic Quadrant at the time, there was 25 different companies on there. And it was everything from, these companies that had started a cloud, like an Amazon, the retail companies started a cloud. So they were now going to be in the cloud space. You had Microsoft, who had been a packaged software company, was now doing cloud software. You had telco providers being cloud providers. You had, other sorts of companies that were sort of, specialized and unique. And I think, back then you could sort of go like, well, I think they'll probably win and they probably have certain moats that'll work. But the reality is there was still 20-something companies, 30-something companies, and many, many more behind them that people were like, hey, they are worth discussing in this space. Now, the difference is, none of those companies were multi-trillion-dollar companies. But I think as we go through this list, we're going to see a little bit of like, oh, okay, at any given time, you're going to feel like you know what the landscape is right this moment. But the reality is like the landscape could significantly change for a lot of reasons. So let's go ahead and kind of dive into a bunch of these different companies and sort of, why they might be doing well at this point in time and what sort of big concern they might have. And if they make the right decision, they'll probably succeed. And if they make some of the wrong decisions or other certain things happen, maybe they fall off of the position that they're in the marketplace. So first on the list is NVIDIA. You can't talk about AI these days without talking about NVIDIA. They just had as of, we're recording this on May 25th, but as of this week, they had another blockbuster quarter. Profits were up like 600% and they beat their numbers and all sorts of things. So NVIDIA right now is the company that, they're the equivalent of the company during the gold rush in the United States that was selling picks and shovels, right? They are selling infrastructure to everybody with AI dreams, everybody with AI plans and strategies. And whether or not those companies succeed or fail, NVIDIA is making money off them. And because their supply chain is so constrained at this point, they are able to, kind of get premium pricing for what they do. They're dictating who's getting GPUs. They're sort of in control of the marketplace. So stock is way up. Everybody talks about, hey, if you bought their stock in 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, it's up 5x and all those sorts of things. So you would think, hey, NVIDIA is in the catbird seat. They are sort of in first place, and that's a valid thing. Now the questions for NVIDIA become, number one, when you are selling picks and shovels and the expectations for your business are incredibly high, what happens when some of those people that are digging those wells or digging for gold don't find gold, right? Let's say they realize that, hey, we're not making as much money as we expected. The demand is not necessarily there, or other things like that. What happens when, an Intel comes out with Gaudi 3, or AMD comes out with something, or companies start figuring out, we don't necessarily want the biggest model in the world. So NVIDIA, if you're sitting there right now, is probably going, hey, is anybody building an alternative to CUDA, their software stack, which is, sort of the thing that developers write to? They have to be concerned somewhat that the people that are building AI models are going to be profitable, that their customers are as successful as they are successful, and they have to be looking at some of the largest cloud providers who are saying, hey, we are incredibly dependent on a single vendor who can completely control our pricing. How do we get out of this type of situation? We're already seeing, Google building TPUs. Microsoft has talked about building their own GPUs and so forth. So they are in a great position right now, but they are, obviously dependent on the market being successful with AI. They are trying to determine, should they be vertically competitive versus horizontally supplying to all of their customers. So lots of things that, while NVIDIA has lots of tailwinds right now, lots of big questions that are sort of on their horizon that they'll have to figure out. Second company I have on my list, and these are in no way, they're in no alphabetical order, and not necessarily, me doing a stack ranking of just sort of grabbing names of the ones who are probably getting the most headlines. Second on the list is Google, right? On one hand, you look at Google and you go, there's probably no company who is has more depth from an AI perspective in the industry, in terms of they've been doing AI for a very long time. It is behind their, it is one of the core technologies behind one of their, the biggest money-making business model in the world in terms of serving ads on the internet. They've got the DeepMind team and the Google Brain team who have been building most of the technologies that people have been, using. Teams like OpenAI came out of Google and so forth. So, on one hand, Google should have the deepest moat in the industry in terms of AI. On the other hand, we're already starting to see people question some of those things, right? Like Google itself is going through an existential question of, if generative AI can give people answers better than 10 blue links, what happens to their search business, which funds everything they do? Can they shift from one form of serving information about the world in terms of, search and crawling the web and SEO and all those sort of things, to, what happens if people start asking the new thing, the new search engine, and the search engine just gives you the answer, right? What does that do to the entire Google ecosystem, right? We're already starting to see people question the results of some of the Google search generated content. You see some weird things out there. How good is it going to be? Is it going to be as good from a quality perspective as Google has been in the past? Google is definitely going through, some questioning of, hey, what are we doing? We've seen some people leave and so on and so forth. So, Google is going through a significant sort of question, internal evaluation of themselves, of like, how much does generative AI impact our biggest business, which is ultimately the biggest business in the world. They've also got sort of an interesting strategic decision to figure out, in terms of, they have Android. They have their own phone, but they have a huge ecosystem of third-party phones that rely on Android. But now they have their own model. And, on the mobile side of things, which is right now the predominant computing paradigm that we have in terms of, people interacting with things, do they double down on a very vertically oriented, vertically integrated stack of, Pixel hardware, for example, or Google hardware, plus Google operating system in terms of Android, or some Android optimized for AI, plus, say, like the Gemini model, a specialized small Gemini model built for, a local device, plus some augmentation from the cloud. That's a possibility. It disrupts their current strategy of how they do mobile. It also disrupts their strategy of working very closely with Apple in terms of, they provide, they are sort of first-party search for all Apple devices, iOS devices, and so on and so forth. That potentially disrupts the second largest or the first largest company in the world in terms of Apple and the relationship they have around iOS and iPhones and so forth. So a couple of interesting big questions for Google. Third one I have on the list is OpenAI. OpenAI, on one hand, people would argue has the best generative AI model today in terms of GPT-4, GPT-4o. Some of the things that have come out of that, we're seeing amazing things around voice, around video creation with things like Sora. But on the other hand, while their technology is incredibly interesting, the people side of OpenAI seems to be a very open question, if you will, right? On one hand, you've got Sam Altman, who, depending on the day, depending on the headline, wants to be portrayed as trying to position himself somewhere between Jesus and Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and all of the the biggest names in terms of technologies and religions. He talks in sort of sometimes crazy platitudes of the new universal currency should be compute, and people should, government should give out a share of compute that people can then barter for other things as opposed to, necessities like food and shelter and other stuff. We've already seen him, not just 6 months ago, got kicked out of his company, and then over the weekend sort of, came back and had control of his company. He is incredibly dependent on, sources of funding to be able to, put together the computing systems that are needed in order for him to be able to create this model. So whether it is dependency on Microsoft and Azure, whether it's, this sort of unknown relationship that's being, it's been written about, some sort of arrangement between OpenAI and Apple, him trying to go out and raise rounds of funding at, 80 or $100 billion valuations from sovereign wealth funds, him going outside of OpenAI and trying to, look at funding these gigantic compute factories in other places. So, you've got a leader with gigantic ambitions, but at the same time, a level of kind of, what might be perceived as instability by certain people, especially the people who might be his partners. We look at the arrangements that are currently in place between people like OpenAI and Microsoft, and while it appeared for a while that, hey, maybe Microsoft had made a tremendous early decision to get out in front of this, way out in front. They don't necessarily have control of the board. They didn't necessarily control what happened when Sam was ousted and then brought back in place. There seems to be a lot of vagueness around the agreement between Microsoft and OpenAI in terms of, what does Microsoft have access to today in terms of intellectual property versus at some point, if the board of OpenAI just declares, hey, we've reached AGI, augmented general intelligence, all of that then goes back to being under the control of OpenAI, right? So, they are a company who obviously has tremendous intelligence in terms of technical skills, in terms of their models. Their partnership strategy is very unknown at this point. It's not clear if they want to be independent. It's not clear if they have to, sort of be like a teenager, be completely dependent on their parents for a while in terms of funding, and then they're going to break out and go through their independent period. So lots of open-ended questions around OpenAI. Oh, by the way, it's not clear that they are, making any money at this point, or that, the hundreds and hundreds of companies that are building on top of them are making any money at this point, right? So again, lots of open-ended questions. Next on my list was Microsoft / Azure / GitHub. So Microsoft has probably made the biggest bet at this point in terms of integrating OpenAI into everything they do. And up until Thanksgiving of last year, it seemed like a brilliant strategy. They had gotten out in front of this. They had a huge ownership stake. They were integrating it, along with the work that was happening in GitHub with Copilot. You've seen the Copilot branding across all of Microsoft, Copilot 365, Copilot, Office, all those sort of things. And then the Thanksgiving 2023 thing happened, and Microsoft appeared to be sort of blindsided. Satya Nadella was sort of saying, "Hey, look, the only person we really deal with over at OpenAI is Sam Altman. We need to be, more integrated with that team." Again, it's not completely clear what they own in terms of OpenAI, because OpenAI seems to be bouncing around all the time. And so you've seen over the last few months, you've seen Microsoft essentially saying, we need to hedge our bets, right? They've gone out, they've made investments in things like Mistral. You've seen them acquire some companies who are, had developed their own variations of models, and they are bringing them in under different auspices. I have to go back and look at the name, but they acquired a company here a couple of months ago, and they're sort of calling them their consumer AI business. But again, it feels like a hedge. So Microsoft went from being the company that we said, "Hoy, this is going to be their way to leapfrog AWS and to sort of leapfrog back into the number one position." And the uncertainty around OpenAI sort of brings a lot of that into question, right? They're doing some really amazing things, but the question becomes, can you, what engine or models are they reliant upon? Is it entirely on OpenAI? Is it only partially? Have they ramped up their knowledge in this space? So lots of questions on the Microsoft side. Next on the list is Amazon and AWS. Amazon was the one company of the largest cloud providers who basically didn't have necessarily a complete control over their model ecosystem, right? Google had been doing it for years, Google Brain, Google, building the models around that. Microsoft had bet on OpenAI. OpenAI seemed to be way out ahead. And AWS was sort of taking the models as a service. We're going to be sort of neutral. We're going to have our own models, but we're going to work with lots of third parties like Anthropic and plenty of others. And all that was under the Bedrock umbrella. And to a certain extent, that strategy would align to what they had done in cloud that had made them successful. We are going to provide all the tools and all the fundamental building blocks that builders need, right? Sort of following their model. And the marketplace sort of said, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure you have any in-depth expertise in this stuff. I'm not sure that you've bet on the right ones. Maybe these other models from Google or Microsoft or OpenAI or others are winning, right? We've seen them take a position in Anthropic of about $4 billion, but not nearly as big of a position as Microsoft has an OpenAI and other things. We recently saw Adam Selipsky, who was CEO for about 3 years, just recently get pushed out for Matt Garman to be the new CEO. And so, some speculation is because he didn't get their AI strategy right. Whether that's totally true or not, it's, again, undetermined, but that probably played some role in it, right? The recent announcements that we've seen from Amazon, while they were relevant to AWS, were coming from Andy Jassy. They weren't coming from Adam Selipsky. So, Amazon and AWS still has a leadership position, the leading position in cloud. The question becomes, does that, transition from being the cloud leader mean they will become the AI leader? And, as we've said in the past, being the leader in one age of computing doesn't necessarily mean that you will be the leader in the next age of computing, right? If you look at, mainframes to mini computers, yeah, that was mostly IBM, but you started to have some more competition. You went from mini computers to PCs. Okay, that became the Wintel era. It was Microsoft and Intel sort of dominated that space. As we went from, PCs and servers where Microsoft started to have was a bigger player in that. We moved to mobile. Well, Microsoft didn't necessarily win in that space. Mobile went to Apple and it went to Google. We went to cloud and it wasn't necessarily Apple and Google. It was AWS. And now we're moving into AI, and the question becomes like, who will be the leader in that? And it's not necessarily known. It's not necessarily scripted. And it's not necessarily guaranteed that the company that was winning before is necessarily going to be the leader in the next sort of era, the next generation. So lots of questions there as well. We look at Meta, and Meta, we typically wouldn't be a company that we would have a big conversation on this podcast because we tend to focus more on sort of enterprise type of discussions and technologies. But Meta was one of the first ones to really come out and say, hey, we have a huge presence in AI. We've been obviously doing a ton of stuff, just like Google in the ad space. They make hundreds of billions of dollars serving ads, and AI plays a huge role in that business. But they were the first to come along and go, we are going to build a model and release the model with some sort of open capability, right? Sort of open enablement, not necessarily a truly open license the way that we expect with open source software, but the first to sort of say, hey, the Llama 2 at the time, now Llama 3 models are open for other people to use. And so, their plans around AI could be in a lot of different areas. We know they obviously, are huge in social media, in advertising. They're in mobile with things like Instagram and WhatsApp and all that stuff. But, they're the first to sort of say, well, we want to unlock what's possible with a variation of open. And, obviously Llama 3 just came out. There's lots going on there. But they're not a company who traditionally you would think about as open source per se. So we'll see what happens with Meta, right? Meta, at least in the context of open models, gigantic open models, now seems to be sort of the leading player in terms of people saying, well, if we're going to build things, maybe we'll build them on top of a Llama variation model, right? So that's going to open up different things in the marketplace. Next on the list is Apple. Apple has sort of been in the market for AI for a while. Products like Siri have been built into, Mac OS and iOS and other types of devices. But Siri generally has been considered a failure, considered way behind, even behind Alexa and so forth. And so the question is, what is Apple doing? Apple obviously wants to be, as a company who is, primarily dependent on great on-device experiences, whether those devices are an iPhone, a Mac, the new Vision Pro, all those types of things. They're a device company. Yes, they have some cloud services, but the cloud services, aren't considered great. They're fine. But their great experience is based on the device itself and in some interaction with the cloud. So the expectation would be that the device, that any AI that they do should be somewhat local to the device, right? The device, has built-in GPUs. It doesn't necessarily have a ton of memory that you would necessarily need for AI. And so lots of speculation about what's happening in the Apple space. We've started to see them release some small language models. I think it's called Phi. We'll put some links in the show notes. But Apple has a lot to figure out. Now, the good news for Apple is they have a lot of money to figure it out. I mean, probably the biggest cash hoard of any of the large tech companies. There is some speculation recently that they are doing some agreements with OpenAI. What that means to be determined, right? We've yet to see what that might mean. Does that mean that sort of relationship will, cause OpenAI to focus less on Microsoft? Maybe. Does that mean that OpenAI and Apple will become a vertically integrated play, kind of going after all sorts of experiences, including search, in which case that will turn off the Google relationship that Apple has, to be determined, right? We don't know what that's going to be. So Apple is this, gigantic, very well-funded, very, very wealthy sort of unknown in the AI space that could have, ramifications in terms of search, in terms of mobile, in terms of future, augmented reality types of things that could be improved with AI. But how they're going to get there is still to be determined, right? I'll throw out a couple more. That's sort of the big ones on the list. I'll throw out a few more. IBM and Red Hat recently went down the path of IBM. Obviously, has done AI for more than a decade with Watson. Now have evolved that into Watson X. They've been getting into the Gen AI space. They recently released, as of a couple weeks ago, I did some podcasts about this, something they call Instruct Lab. So Instruct Lab allows smaller models, for example, like the open source Granite models that IBM and Red Hat put out, but any model that's out there, to be synthetically trained using a language and a framework that doesn't necessarily require data scientists. So the Instruct Lab space is out there really going after kind of enterprise use cases in which the expectation is people are going to build models specific to certain areas that they need skills and knowledge and expertise for businesses. So a little bit different than the gigantic model approach, trying to address specific enterprise needs at a smaller form factor. Also, one of the only companies that can really deliver this on premises, whereas most of the other ones are based on giant GPU farms in the cloud. Oracle, one of the largest ones, really hasn't laid out a strategy per se, not anything that people are distinctly talking about. So Oracle, unusually missing in this space for a company that, is in the data space or has been around the data space, kind of missing at this point in time as of, May of 2024. So who knows what Oracle will do? Oracle, again, very, very well-funded company. We see both Snowflake and Databricks getting into the, quote unquote, enterprise LLM space. But again, what are they competing for? Are they competing to be gigantic LLMs. They're trying to position themselves as being better than Llama 3 and some of these other ones. So they're, to this point, companies that, have seen lots of data. The question is, what are they training their data on? Are they training it on your business's data? How did they go about getting it to be, the size that they are? And what are they kind of positioning it for? Are they positioning it for alternative cloud services? Are they positioning it eventually to be on premises? Are they going to be chasing the largest models in the world, the OpenAIs and the Metas and some of the others? So that's still to be determined for those companies. And then you finally get to one of the things that we talk about a lot, which is VCs and startups. The VC community seems to be very divided in a couple of ways. Number one, they are already seeing, they've made huge investments in this space. They continue to pour money into this space. But I think they're starting to get a little bit of sticker shock, right? The valuations of these companies that they have created, they have artificially pumped up the value of these companies. And so any new investment they're making is at these sort of expectation levels, again, that were like 2021, right? The sort of unicorn level things that we saw in the cloud native space. The VCs are sort of, they've artificially created tons and tons of value that hasn't necessarily seen revenue yet, right? And so they're on the fence about what do the next round of investments look like. They also seem to all be on the fence in one camp or the other as to whether or not open source models make sense. And they're getting into all sorts of discussions and debates and sort of taking sides on how much government intervention and regulation should be involved, how much open source should be allowed in models and so forth. And they're trying to frame it in terms of, national security and all sorts of other things like that. But they're sort of at a crossroads in terms of figuring out which side of the fence do I want to be on? Do I think we're able to make money on? It is sort of interesting to watch the VCs who weren't necessarily pro open source, prior to AI, are now sort of pro open source because the people they're competing against are Google and Meta and OpenAI and so forth. But yet, they were the same companies who 6 months ago, 12 months ago, were saying that, hey, things based on open source, you can't create business models around. So the VC community is sort of torn in this space, trying to figure out where to go. And then startups are, we're sort of back to 2021 level of craziness with new startups coming out every week. It's going to be very interesting to see how quickly they can figure out how to monetize things, right? What's the cost of them creating their models? What's their business model look like? Is it something that their customers are going to understand? For example, if you're talking in terms of, cost per token, do people really understand that? We've already seen companies like, Stability AI and others who, were based around things that took up a lot of GPU cycles to build things like graphics and images and stuff, are already starting to, run into financial difficulty. So, I think I'll sort of wrap it up there. I've been going for a long time. So if you listen to all this, the thing to take away from it is there is incredible amounts of interesting technologies that are happening right now. And so there's, no reason for people not to be very excited about what's happening. At the same time, if you're hoping that in these early stages, I mean, we are at the very beginning of even what, the Andy Jasseys of the world will say is day one or the first inning. We are the first pitch, if you will, in terms of that analogy. And there is tons of competition. There's lots of unknowns. There are lots of high expectations. And, to kind of go back to the old statement that Bill Gates used to always say, we always overestimate what we can do in 2 years and underestimate what we can get done in 10 years. Well, I think we are, smack in the middle of that right now, right? We overestimate what's going to happen in 2 years. GPT 4.0 comes out and people are asking the next day, well, what's next? And, when is GPT 5 coming out? And when is the next model coming out? And all these sort of things as if, there's going to be normalcy, there's going to be rationalization, there's going to be, sort of rules well defined at this point. I think we are very, very early in the stage. So, when you see headlines around, hey, there is chaos around something, I think the reality is we've sort of forgotten as an industry what it means to be in that storming, norming, forming phase of any sort of market transition, because it's been a decade plus for us. And we had gotten very used to the sort of rationalization and normalcy that was happening in cloud. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I've been going for a long time. Went a little longer for this holiday weekend. Hope everybody is doing well. Thanks, as always, for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show. Thanks for sending us your feedback. And again, show@thecloudcast.net. We'll always try and help you out with those things. So with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.